Welcome to Talk It Over. I'm so thankful that you're joining us and participating in this conversation. I hope that it's blessing you and your team and your friends and the people you invite into this conversation. Today, I'd like you to start out your conversation and your time with each other by talking about signs of hope. One of my favorite signs of hope this past week was this rainbow that Mendy Swan took a picture of and posted on Facebook. She said, "Sweet double rainbow in our backyard this morning. Picture does not do justice." Can you please spend a few minutes talking to each other about the signs of hope that you've seen this past week? Talk about it, and then we'll get back to it with some more conversation. Okay, so one of the signs of hope that I loved the most was Ella, my daughter. This picture was posted online by my wife, sleeping with our dog Sadie. And notice that even when Ella is sleeping, Sadie has her paw on Ella. She is protecting Ella. She's never truly at peace. In fact, all night long, Sadie protects our house from cats and possums. If I don't put the dog door closed, she will be shooting out into the backyard and barking and waking up all the neighbors because she is essentially convinced that our house is constantly under attack from the mailman and everything else. So one of the things that I want to ask you, by the way, Sadie will come back with the hair on the back of her neck standing up, that she's just so unnerved by these events. I want to point out that there's some people who live their whole entire life like this. Some people are so afraid of death that the fear of death, not death itself, but the fear of death shapes nearly all of their decisions. And so one way of thinking about this mindset and this worldview is essentially called survival of the fittest. It's essentially an argument that the person who is the most aggressive and the person who is the most dominant and the person who takes the most advantage of other people and the person who concedes the least amount is the person who will survive the most. But the Bible tells us something completely different entirely, that actually the people who are the most willing to concede and the people who are the most willing to serve others are the people who thrive the most. So I want to ask you before we jump into this is, do you ever find yourself living like you have to fight against others for survival? Essentially having a combative posture, whether it's in relationships, whether it's at work, whether it is on the road, maybe when you're driving. Talk about this. What ways? I'm not even going to ask you if you have had this. Try to find and share ways in your life that you have found yourself having essentially a fight against others for survival mindset. I'll bet you had some good conversations about that. And I want you to know that it's not a new condition, that the early church had this same kind of struggle in their life. That they found that they were responding viscerally. They weren't even responding intentionally, but they were responding viscerally to the conditions and situations they were encountering and essentially coping with those conditions through things like drugs or other addictions, physical addictions. Those were all coping mechanisms to deal with fear and essentially a fear of death. And so I want you to recognize that other people went through this, and this is what the early scripture said and spoke into that condition. In Romans 6, chapter 6, verse 4. Read that together as a group, and then we'll get back and have a conversation about it. Okay, what you read is essentially saying that Jesus is going to change the way that you walk. I love that last piece of scripture that says to allow us to walk in the newness of life. What a great way to think about how we are walking different with Jesus. Imagine someone walking with a depressive posture and then moving forward with a totally different posture before. One that is downtrodden and captivated by sin and darkness and death, and one instead this is the death-minded perspective, and that is the life-minded perspective. The question for you now is, what ways have you found your relationship with Jesus makes you walk with newness? Talk about how you've experienced that in your life. Great. Now I want you to read Romans chapter 6, verse 5 through 8 together as a group. Okay, the idea here is that I would project and encourage you to do is to spend time focusing on the cross of Jesus. Spend time looking at the cross. The cross is the greatest symbol of hope that you could ever find in your life. Think about this. The cross back in the time of Jesus was actually not a symbol of hope. In fact, it wasn't even used as a symbol of hope. For 300 years after Jesus, the earliest Christians were using a fish as a sign of being a Christian because the cross was actually an implement of torture. But through scriptures like this, we have been enlightened to see that the cross is not a symbol of death, but it's a symbol of life for all of us. I want you to talk about the cross. I want you to talk about what the cross has meant to you in your life. And I want you to, and it could be negative things. If you've had negative experiences of the cross, share that. Just talk about how you've experienced it and give some specific examples of times you've remembered reflecting on the cross in your life. Great. Now I want you to read Romans chapter 6, verse 9 through 13. Go around the group. Let everybody read a couple of verses of Scripture. Here's an idea I'd like you to take out of that. That every fiber of your being, every single fiber of your being, can be used to live for God with your life, just like the Scripture talks about. Imagine that you are no longer bound by a death-minded perspective. You are no longer bound by the fear of death, which drives so many decisions in life. But here's the question that I'd like you to think about and talk about. Have you ever found yourself wounding others almost instinctively out of fear? Have you ever experienced moments like that where you find, oh man, what am I doing? And maybe you've caught yourself doing that. Talk about that for a minute. Second question I'd like to ask you is this. How might God be calling you to use your body as weapons to do right? That's how the Scripture says. How might God be calling you to use your body or your mind or your resources or your talents or your imagination or creativity as weapons to do right? Is there any thoughts that you have on that? Now I want you to read Romans 6:14 as a group. The image that I'd like you to think about is one of standing underneath a waterfall. I don't know if you've ever stood under a waterfall before, but you can't hear anything else. It's a nice experience, but it's also an overwhelming experience. It's a very heavy experience. It's one that carries a lot of emotion to it. And so when you're in that waterfall, I want you to think about those moments that maybe you've been in a waterfall and think about grace like that. That grace is the kind of thing where you can't think about anything else, that it's constant, that it flows into your life, God's grace, at a rate even faster than a waterfall, and it pours down over you. And it changes you, when you have a grace-minded focus, that it changes you from having a death or a sin-minded focus in your life into one of being new and restored and vitalized in those moments. And that grace doesn't just cover over you in the moment, it covers over you for all of the future life and all of the past life you've had for all of your life. The idea here is that you are under grace. I want you to answer this question. How might an under grace mindset change how you live your life? How would you live your life differently if you could keep your eyes and mind focused on the grace of God? Fantastic. Thank you for joining us for Talk It Over. I pray that it was a good conversation you had. Now's the time for you guys to have some prayer together and to ask each other for their praise reports. And if you've had any good things or that you want to share good things that have happened, and also petition, which is another way of saying asking, things that you want to ask God for. Share your prayers together with each other and look forward to next week. We're going to have a fantastic continued conversation about hope.